Check 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test.
Defenses and fears, you're welcome here. Yes, you're welcome here. Yes, you're welcome here.
Good afternoon. I'm Reverend Dave Thompson, and I'm so excited to bring you back to our Civil Human Bible study today. I'm a civil human minister, so what that means is that I focus my ministry on building human peace and common ground. And it's in that effort that I'm attempting to look at my own spiritual heritage, the Judeo-Christian scriptures, and looking at the teachings of Jesus to try to find those teachings that I feel are applicable across the board. To all humans, regardless of our different faiths, our different lifestyles, and our different politics. So we're continuing right now in our conversation with Jesus, actually the account of his conversation about the end times. His disciples, his students have just asked him, hey, you just mentioned that the temple, which is their big place where they do all their worship in ancient Israel, the disciples said, you said it's going to be destroyed. When's this going to happen? And you said you're coming back. When's that happening? So that's what we're conversing about today. And I want to walk you through this parable it's called the parable or story of the 10 virgins and what in the heck that means and how it has any application to us today. Let's go ahead and jump into the passage. It's Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 through 12. Starting with verse 1. Then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamp and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were wise and 5 were foolish. Those who were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. But while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. And at midnight a cry was heard, Behold, the bridegroom is coming, go out and meet him. Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise answered, saying, No, lest there should not be enough for us and you. But go rather to those who sell and buy for yourselves. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. Afterward the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered and said, Assuredly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming. So this is a continuation on the study that we had yesterday, where Jesus was talking about a master of a household and his servants. And he went away, and his servant who put in charge was beating the fellow servants and was living luxuriously and hanging out with drunkards while he was gone, and came back and found that guy and basically punished him. And now he's talking again a little bit about this idea of not being prepared or not being watchful. I want to walk through what this parable is about, because this is really wrapped up in an ancient world that is 2,000 years removed from us. And even though there's some practices within Judaism that still practice these wedding rituals, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us here and now. And that's why I want to walk through it so you have an idea of what in the world Jesus is talking about here. Interestingly enough, I was doing some research, and there's a lot of people who go through and look at the stories that Jesus gives, and they try to test whether it was historical, whether this is an actual parable of Jesus. And for those who are maybe history buffs, this one in particular is present. This parable is present in all of the manuscripts that we have. So it is without a doubt, well, not without a doubt, but very possibly and very clearly originally told by Jesus, which I love. This is so interesting to me. So, what the heck with the virgins, and why 10 of them, and what is this bridegroom, and what's the wedding feast, and why do they have lamps, and why do they need oil, right? So we don't qualify women in terms of being virgin or not, thank goodness, and we don't do that also for men. In this day and age, however, it was very much part of the process of being part of the wedding. So essentially when they mean virgins, when they say that, it means that they are unwed. In other words, they are single women. And this is really the bride's, they're girls, right? The party that is part of the women's, or bridesmaids, was what we would call them today. They don't do as much intensity as they did back then, and they certainly don't wait around at midnight with oil lamps waiting for the groom to come. But I want to explain what happens in this ancient marriage culture so that we understand what Jesus is talking about, and if there's any implication and application for us today. So here's how the wedding goes, essentially, in ancient Israel around this time. The bride and the groom are betrothed. The bride over here is getting prepared, and then the bridegroom basically has set up a place for them to live in his house, probably within his household, a separate room or something. And so when the wedding starts, there's a bunch of festivities around it, but when the actual sort of wedding starts, the bridegroom comes over with his entourage and his groomsmen and makes his way over to the bride, and they don't really know when this is going to happen. Keep in mind, there's no cell phones, they don't have messengers, they don't have really no way to talk to each other. So they just wait for each other to show up. So when this bridegroom, the groom that is, gets there, they say, hey, let's go. They grab the bride and the wedding party of hers, the bridesmaids, and then they go back to the house of the groom, and then they have this week-long festivity. It's called a wedding feast, which is basically just a ton of food and a ton of different activities. The bride actually stays in her room for the whole event and doesn't come out till really the end, in which at that point the groom and her go into the wedding chamber and consummate their marriage, and that's basically it. And then she essentially lives at that household. So what do the virgins have to do, and why is Jesus using this particular story to communicate what he's saying? When we're looking at the virgins here, or basically the bridesmaids, these are individuals who are waiting for this bridegroom. And Jesus uses this particular analogy because he's trying to communicate the idea that, yes, he is going to return, and yes, there is going to be a culmination at the end, meaning that God is going to seek justice for all the wrongs that are done in the world. But that's not going to come for a while, but you should be prepared. And yesterday we talked about the story of that servant who was not doing what he was supposed to be doing, but was actually doing some bad stuff. We have the same kind of conversation here. There's 10 virgins waiting for the groom to come, and they've got oil lamps. Again, they don't know when he's going to show up, so they just have to have the oil lamps there so they can see and walk around in the dark if they need to. 5 of those ladies do not have enough oil, or they didn't bring extra supplies, and 5 did. Now we have this really weird interruption and insert into the story where it says that they, because the bridegroom is taking a while, he wasn't showing up on time, so the women fall asleep. And what is this about? So here is where a lot of scholars, when they look in this passage, they think that Matthew, who was writing this, may have inserted this particular passage. But regardless, essentially this is the communication in this account to the people back then. Look, Jesus hasn't come back yet, but you need to wait. So in other words, the early church, after the death of Jesus, those people who were around back then, they thought that Jesus was going to be returning within their lifetime. That was really what they thought. And so as Matthew's writing this account to the people of that first century, they're frustrated because they're waiting for Jesus to come back and nothing's happening. And so he's saying to them, look, the bridegroom was late, but he's going to be coming, so be prepared. And so then we have these 5 foolish women, for whatever reason, say to the other women, look, we don't have any oil, can you give us some? And they're like, no, we can't give you any oil because we're not going to have enough for ourselves otherwise. And so they sent the other women away. They go to the merchants, which are closed. And while they're gone, the bridegroom comes and meets them, and the wedding party goes off. And then they go to the feast and the celebration. And the foolish ladies are left there out in the cold and essentially said, we don't know who you are. So what in the world does this have to do with anything? And why does Jesus use this particularly weird sort of scenario to talk about his return? One of the things that I want to highlight here again is that when this account was written, the people who were reading it were again frustrated that Jesus hadn't returned yet. Now, there are a lot of people today who still look for the return of Jesus, who are waiting for this particular statement of Jesus to be fulfilled. And it's their thought that at the end of everything, when we come to this climax as a human population, when this abomination that causes desolation or this Antichrist shows up, it's at this time that Jesus is going to come back, but we don't really know when. And so this communication is essentially be prepared, but beyond that, be wise. Now, this was a little bit of a struggle, I'll be honest with you, personally, trying to figure out how do I apply this to us as human beings, just as a human, not necessarily as a Christian or a person of faith, just as a human being. How do I look at this and figure out how to relay it to my fellow humans out there? There was a couple things that struck me, and one of them is there is wisdom in being prepared. And I'd like to tell a story about my own experience with Starbucks. I was a barista for a little while, and then I ended up working in their global business systems in their corporate office. They call it the support center. But essentially, at that time, I took on the task of building the software to manage their inventory globally, and we were pushing it out over the browser so that they could do inventory internationally. Anyway, before that, I was a barista. So I was slinging coffee, right? And I was responsible to get coffee to the people who need it. I was their dealer of caffeine in the mornings. Now, one of the things that Starbucks did often was to send what they called secret shoppers. And these would be people who we wouldn't know about, who would show up in line, and they would go through the process, and they would secretly be making notes on how we greeted them, how long it took to get through the line, what the appearance of the coffee was, what the temperature of the coffee was, what the taste of it was, did they feel happy? There's all these questions that they had to fill out. The idea being, in order to get the best picture of what people are really like, you have to show up when they're not prepared or when they are not expecting. And I think this particular conversation is something that is relevant to us and actually means a lot to us today. Being prepared means being on the go and means watching and taking thought for our good actions when nobody's watching. Sure, those of us who come from a place of faith expect and believe that God is going to come back down in the end, that there's going to be a justice executed to all people, good and bad, and that there's going to be a return of him to the earth and finally to help us progress or do whatever it is that we're going to do after that point. And then, of course, there are others, those of us who may not believe that there's going to be a final judgment. So why in the world would this conversation matter to us in those contexts? I think really the conversation comes down to how we and why we do good things. In the story, the 5 foolish virgins were the ones who didn't prepare. They weren't really paying attention. They really didn't do what they needed to do to be ready and to be able to function in the situations that they needed to. Today, right here and right now, there's probably few times in history that have been so important for us to be prepared and to be watching. There are many who are challenging the basic constructs of how we as a human species live together, of what leadership looks like and how that leadership is chosen, of how wealth is distributed and whether people should or can, or if it's good for them to hold on to vast amounts of it or not. And whether it's important for us as a human species, because we can do it now, to provide care for them in their sickness and in their homelessness. We have the means to do that. We never have had that opportunity before as a species. So I really do think that there's no more important time for us than now to be prepared. And that means being aware of why we're doing the good things that we do. There are a lot of people who come from a Christian or from a faith background, and it can be anything, Catholic, it can be Buddhist, it can be Islam or Judaism. But the idea is that they're always fearful that there's this judgmental God standing there waiting for them to mess up, and they always have to be on guard because the all-seeing eye is going to judge them. I don't think that that's the message here. The idea is that there's a celebration coming for those of us who are going to try to do what is good. And as we move forward, we need to decide why we are doing good things. Is it because we're afraid of being caught? Is it because we're afraid of a judgmental God? Those don't really work too well as a motivation. And as I'm sure if you've seen Undercover Boss, or that I mentioned yesterday that Corrigan loves to watch, or even talking about the Secret Shopper, when you instill fear in people, it's a pretty terrible motivator. But when we instill a love for what is good, a desire to do good because it yields good, when we desire to live a life that is good for others and for ourselves, to be humble, to be peacemakers, to be compassionate, to be merciful, when we decide to embrace these good things and live for them because they yield for us a good life, that's when we can begin to be prepared for whatever happens down the road. When we are relying on fear, or when we are relying upon the rules to keep us in line, when everything falls apart, so will we. But as we move forward, as we are walking through these big questions that we have to ask ourselves as a species on this planet, knowing and understand why we do good and doing it because it yields good is what will truly help us be prepared to survive that time and to make it through, to be able to celebrate on the other end in a society that does embrace those good qualities. I want to thank you for joining me today so much, and I've loved having you on board in this journey alongside of me, and I appreciate your comments that you've shared with me and your encouragement. If you have thoughts or reflections, please do leave those comments in the comments below the video. I absolutely love it, and it really helps all of us to learn and to grow. And until tomorrow, when we'll meet yet again, live at noon, and we'll share another story and talk about some other good things, I want you to know that I love you. And I hope you choose to love yourself. It is the only love in this world that we have any control over. And now I would invite you to join me as we go about the rest of our day, loving those around us the same way. Thank you.